Welcome back to this special World Book Day series of videos, and this is Too Fond of Books. This video will be another story from More Stories from Shakespeare Told to the Children by Jeanie Lang, and I am going to read the story of King Lear. Once upon a time there was an old king of Britain whose name was Lear. He had no son to succeed him, and his wife was dead, but he had 3 daughters, named Goneril, Regan, and Cordelia. Regan and Goneril were married to British dukes, but Cordelia, who was the youngest and the one that Lear loved the best, was not married and stayed with her father in his palace. Cordelia was very beautiful and very sweet and good, and she was very brave. She had the bravest bravery of all, the bravery that is never afraid to speak the truth. Now Lear felt that he was growing so old that it was time for someone else to reign over Britain. He made up his mind to share his kingdom amongst his 3 daughters. As Cordelia had no husband to help her rule, he said she must marry. There were 2 great men who wished to marry Cordelia. One was the King of France, and the other a French duke, and they both said that they loved her very greatly. One day King Lear called together a great meeting of his nobles and people and told them that he was going to share his kingdom amongst his daughters. But I must first of all find out which of my daughters loves me the best, he said. For the one whose love for me is the greatest must have the greatest share of what belongs to me. Then he asked his eldest daughter, Goneril, how much she loved him. I love you, she said, more than any words can tell. I love you more dearly than my eyesight, than my freedom, than all the riches in the world. I love you as much as my life, my health, my beauty, my honor. No child ever loved a father more than I love you. King Lear was so pleased with Goneril for this that he gave her one of the best parts of his kingdom, lands full of rich meadows, great forests, and noble rivers, and said it was to belong to her and her children forevermore. Then he asked his second daughter, Regan, how much she loved him. Regan answered, Goneril has spoken for me. I say all that she says, and more still. For I love you so dearly, so truly, so greatly, that there is for me no other joy in life as great as the joy of loving my own dear father. King Lear was as much pleased with Regan as he had been with Goneril. To her he gave another part of his kingdom, as beautiful and as rich as the part he had given to her sister. Then he turned to Cordelia, who was his dearest daughter, and asked her to tell him how much she loved him. But Cordelia had listened with anger and disgust to all that her sisters had said. She knew it was not true, and that they had only said all those fine things that they might make their father give them a large share of his kingdom. So when it came to her turn to speak, she would say nothing. What have you got to say? Asked King Lear. Nothing, said Cordelia. Nothing? Asked King Lear in great surprise. Nothing, again said Cordelia. Then Lear, growing angry, told her that she must speak. You are my father, said Cordelia. You have taken care of me and loved me. I obey you, I honor you, I love you. But if my sisters speak truly when they say they love you best of all, I do not know why they married, for they must love you better than they love their husbands. If I ever marry, I shall give my husband half my care, half my duty, half my love. I shall never marry to do as my sisters do, and love my father the best of all. Do you with all your heart mean what you say? Asked Lear. Yes, my good lord, said Cordelia. Are you so young and so untender? Said Lear. So young, my lord, and true, answered Cordelia. Then King Lear fell into a fearful rage. He called Cordelia cruel names and said she was no longer his daughter, and that he hated her now as much as he had loved her before. He told Goneril and Regan that in future they must reign as queens of Britain in his stead, and their husbands as kings. He divided the kingdom between them and gave them everything else he had, excepting 100 knights that he kept for his own service. With those knights he said he would stay month about with Goneril and with Regan, but he never wished to see Cordelia more. One of the nobles who heard the king say those unkind things was brave enough to tell him how wrong he was. This was the Duke of Kent, the bravest and the best of all the king's subjects. But when he begged the king not to be so cruel to Cordelia, who dearly loved him and had only spoken the truth, Lear was still more angry. He drew his sword and tried to kill the Duke of Kent, and then, in a fury, banished him from Britain forever. As the Duke went sorrowfully away, the King of France and the French Duke arrived. King Lear told them what had happened, and that Cordelia, instead of being a rich princess, was now no richer than a beggar girl. The French Duke said to her, if you have lost a father, you have lost a husband too. I cannot marry you. But the King of France said, I love you now more than I ever loved you before, fair Cordelia. Come with me and be my queen, and queen of all my beautiful France. Again Lear told her she was no longer his daughter, and her sisters mocked at her. But Cordelia's heart could not have been all filled with sadness, for the noble king who was to be her husband loved her not for any riches, but just for her own dear sake. When Cordelia and her husband had sailed away to France, Lear and his 100 knights went to stay at Goneril's castle. But all Goneril's loving words had been said only to gain a big share of her father's lands, and when she had got this share, she no longer pretended to love him. When Lear gave orders to her servants, she told the servants not to obey him. She grumbled at her father and his knights and the troubles she said they gave, and scolded the poor old man. She also did her best to make his servants give up his service and come and serve her and her husband. Every cruel, hurtful thing she could do to her father, this wicked daughter did. But King Lear had 2 good friends to serve him. One was only his jester, a man who wore a cap with jingling bells and said funny, foolish things, like a clown in a circus. He was not as foolish as he seemed, and he loved his master dearly. The other was a new servant called Caius, but Caius was not his real name. He was really the good Duke of Kent, who had come back from his banishment under another name that he might serve the old king and save him from the cruelty of his 2 wicked daughters. One day when Goneril's head servant was very rude to Lear, Caius knocked him down. The servant told Goneril, and Goneril came and raged at her father. Then King Lear lost his temper and told Goneril what he thought of her. How much sharper than a serpent's tooth it is to have a thankless child, he said sorrowfully. He was terribly sad and disappointed that Goneril, who had pretended to love him so much, should treat him so badly. They had a fierce quarrel, and he left Goneril's castle for that of Regan, sending Caius, the disguised Duke of Kent, on in front of him to tell Regan he was coming. Goneril also sent a messenger with a letter to Regan, telling her sister not to have Lear to stay with her. Her rude head servant took this letter and rode up to the castle where Regan and her husband were staying at the same time that Caius got there. He and Caius at once began to quarrel. Caius began to beat him with the flat of his sword, and the servant shouted for help. Regan, her husband, and some of her friends came to see what all the noise was about, and when they found Lear's servant beating Goneril's servant, they were very angry. Caius, who was really Duke of Kent, was at once put in the stocks in front of the castle. There he had to sit like a common thief, with his legs stuck through boards and tightly fastened so that he could not get away. It was one of the most shameful punishments that Regan could have given him, but she was glad to bring shame on one of her father's servants. While Caius sat in the stocks, there rode up to the castle Lear, his jester, and one of his knights. The king stopped in horror when he saw his servant in the stocks, and was very angry when he found that it was Regan and her husband who had put him there. Caius asked him why he had only 1 knight, and what had become of the 99 who were his servants. The jester answered his questions in a rhyme, which meant that the 99 faithless knights had all left Lear and served wicked Goneril instead of being faithful to their poor old king, when they saw that Lear's daughters did not really love him and were unkind to him, and that he had no money left. Lear told the servants of the castle to tell Regan and her husband that he had arrived and wished to see them at once. But they sent back a message with many excuses for not seeing him. They were not feeling very well, they said. They had not long arrived at the castle and were tired from their journey, for they had traveled all night. But Lear knew that these were only made-up excuses, and it hurt him to think that the daughter who had said she loved him so much did not really love him at all. He had not waited long at the castle before the sound of trumpets told him that the wicked Goneril had arrived. She and Regan sided together against their father. They told him he was a silly old man, and that it was very selfish and foolish of him to think of staying in their castles with 100 followers. 5 nights were quite enough for him, they said, and they mocked at him because he was old and weak. Then Lear, his heart nearly breaking, rushed out of the castle, and his faithful jester and Caius and the one faithful knight followed. As he went away, the sky was growing dark, and the wind was rising. Soon the rain fell furiously, and the winds of heaven were howling. Then came the roll of thunder and the flash of lightning. Regan and Goneril knew that for miles and miles there was no shelter, only bleak moors, with not even a tree under which to hide from the storm, but they did not care. It is his own fault, they said. It serves him right for being so foolish. Meantime, their old father and his 3 faithful friends were crossing the moor in the teeth of the furious storm. The wind tossed about the king's white hair, and his clothes were drenched through and through. Caius, or to call him by his real name, the Duke of Kent, sent off the only one of Lear's 100 knights who was still faithful to him to be his messenger to France. He told him to tell Cordelia what her sisters had done, and how she must come with an army to help Lear. For he who had been king of Britain had now not even a hut of his own in which to hide from the storm. In the sleet and thunder and driving rain, Lear and Caius and the jester wandered on. The jester did his best to cheer up his master. He tried to make jokes, and he sang him a song. He that has and a little tiny wit, with hey ho, the wind and the rain, must make content with his fortunes fit, though the rain it raineth every day. But his daughter's unkindness and the fury of the storm had done so much harm to King Lear that he would neither think nor understand clearly. He was very tired and very cold and very miserable, and he could not talk of anything but the unkindness and ingratitude of Goneril and Regan. When night fell, the rolling thunder sounded more terrible in the darkness. When the lightning flashed through the inky blackness, it showed only the loneliness of the moor with its furze and heather and rough grass, and never a tree at all. The wind howled and moaned and drove the rain before it, and the rain that stung their faces and drenched them was all the more furious because it had swept across that barren country right off the waves of a stormy sea. When even the brave heart of Caius had begun to sink, they came by chance on a lonely little hovel on the moor. It was not much more than a shelter of turf and branches, but it was better than the open moor, and the jester gladly went in. But he ran out, screaming with fright, because inside there was a poor man lying in some straw. He had no clothes on and would only talk nonsense. Lear, whose misery had made him almost as foolish as this man, asked him if it was the cruelty of his daughters that had made him so miserable. But the man could not talk sense. "Poor Tom's a cold," he said. "Poor Tom's a cold." While they sheltered in this miserable hut, they saw someone coming with a torch to guide him. When he came up, they saw it was a nobleman who had been Lear's friend. He could not bear to think of him being out on such a terrible night, and came to take him back to the castle. He hid them in an outbuilding there, and when they had rested, he hurried them off to the coast, where he knew they would find Cordelia with a French army behind her, coming to protect her father. Cordelia had got the Duke of Kent's message, and sailed across the sea from France with an army, and landed in Britain. She sent her servants to look for Lear, and they found him madder than poor Tom, wandering round the fields, singing to himself, and crowning his white hair with nettles and other weeds. Cordelia had brought a doctor with her, and hoped that he might cure her father. And indeed, when Lear had been cared for and had rested and slept, he became almost himself again, and was full of joy at seeing Cordelia. But they were not long happy together. Goneril and Regan brought a great army to fight the soldiers that Cordelia had brought from France. There was a fierce battle. The French army was beaten, and Lear and Cordelia were taken prisoners. But the wicked minds of the two sisters were too full of other things for them to be glad that they had their father and Cordelia in their power. They had had a bitter quarrel and hated each other so much that Goneril poisoned Regan. And when Regan died, Goneril in her misery took a dagger and plunged it into her own heart and died too. Lear and Cordelia and Lear's faithful jester were cast into prison, and by the orders of the general of Regan's and Goneril's armies, Cordelia was murdered there, and the poor jester was hanged. Then King Lear's heart could no longer bear his sorrows. His heart was broken, and his tired old mind and body were not strong enough to go on, and so he died, leaving his faithful friend Kent so sorrowful that he said he could not live, but must soon go after his master. I have, he said, a journey shortly to go. My master calls me. I must not say no. King Lear, from More Stories from Shakespeare Told to the Children by Jeanie Lang. I hope you've enjoyed this story, and let me know down in the comment section below if you're familiar with this story or the other two that I read. How do you think Jeanie Lang did summing up the stories and telling them in such a short manner for children? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, and I'll see you for another video again soon. Bye.